Hello friends and foes, my name is Cait and this is my channel Chapter Cviiil. And today we're going to be talking about trigger warnings. So back in November I actually ran some polls about trigger warnings and content warnings. First I wanted to discuss the results of a poll that I put out back in November, the end of November. It was actually a series of polls that I put out, and these were all centering around the topic of trigger warnings and content warnings. The thing to remember that with these polls, these are people that are following me on Twitter or have access to my Twitter in some way or another, so they're probably people that are going to be more closer to my immediate circle. So the first poll was, has a trigger or content warning ever helped you? And out of 60 people, 70% said yes and 30% said no. So 70% of people found that they were helpful, whereas 30% said they weren't helpful or maybe they were indifferent. My next question was, has a trigger or content warning ever annoyed or harmed you in any way? Out of 65 votes, 9.2% said that they had been annoyed by a trigger or content warning at some point, and 1.5% said they had been harmed by a trigger or content warning, whereas 89.2% of people said they had never been annoyed or harmed by a trigger or content warning. My next poll was, how would trigger or content warnings impact your reading experience? So out of 72 votes, 5.6% said that it would ruin or spoil their reading experience. 52.8% said it would benefit or help them in their reading experience, and 41.7% said it would not impact them at all. And then my last poll was, how do trigger or content warnings impact your Twitter experience? So this isn't necessarily your reading experience, but like on social media, how would it impact you there? Out of 72 votes, 6.9% said it harms or annoys them, 45.8% said that it helps them, and 47.2% said it does not impact them. Now again, this is based on a general group. It's not based on specifically people who have trauma histories or anxiety or other mental health concerns. It's just a general group. I put these polls out in November of 2020. It is now January 2021. And it's a discussion I've been wanting to make for a while. Now recently an author put out this message, this statement that was a choice. And I'm just going to read that statement really quick. So this statement was put out by the author of Follow the River by C.E. Ricci. I've never heard of this author before. I just saw this particular statement by the author circulating around. The statement said, this book is a work of fiction, but that does not mean that there aren't very realistic incidents that could be triggering for some readers. Now, I hate trigger warnings. I believe that they can absolutely ruin a book, and as such, I will not be listing the specific triggers within this book. This is a blanket trigger warning. This book is meant to go in blind. I've purposely written the blurb to reveal absolutely nothing about the overall plot of this book. Do not read spoilers, if only for you to receive the full impact of the book in both a plot and emotional aspect. Just trust me, okay? It says. For many readers, you will experience a variety of emotional reaction, and that is a good thing. This book is meant to make you feel. I have no desire to lessen that for you by telling you all the things that happen within these pages that might make someone uncomfortable. This being said, if you have any triggers, any at all, I would suggest reaching out to me to ask if you will be okay reading this book, or maybe giving this book a pass altogether. What I don't suggest, ignoring this altogether and then going to ruining a book for others in any way, shape, or form, because let's be real, I tried to warn you. Don't be a Karen, y'all. I just want to break this statement down a little bit. First of all, a blanket trigger warning does not really work. And I'll discuss that a little bit more when we get into some research that I'm going to talk about. The statement, just trust me, okay, is a little bit concerning because this person doesn't know the readers personally. This person doesn't necessarily have any experience in mental health. They might not. I don't know them personally. It said something about, I don't want to talk about all the things within these pages that might make someone feel uncomfortable. Now, the thing about trigger warnings is that it's supposed to prevent certain people from having an intense emotional reaction. Because when someone is triggered by something, it triggers an intense emotional reaction, not just discomfort. And then it says, if you have any triggers at all, I would suggest reaching out to me. That's what the person says. So they're suggesting that if anyone who ever wants to read their book has any triggers, that they reach out to the author personally and get them to, disclose what triggers might be, a part of their book. So that would require the person who is reading it to self-disclose what their personal triggers are to this author in order to be able to read a book. And then it says, don't be a Karen, y'all. Which, personally, I don't think that someone should be referred to as a Karen for wanting to be careful when it comes to their mental health. Now, I've talked to several people that are in the book community about this that also work in mental health. We have a little bit of a group chat going and we talk about different things. So we discussed a little bit about trigger warnings and content warnings. And I've also done some research on the topic. Now, I do want to talk about where I'm coming from doing this. I work in mental health. I've worked in a psychiatric hospital for the past 5 years as a music therapist. I also have post-traumatic stress disorder. So some of these things are going to be a little close to home for me. And so That's why I felt the need to reach out to research and to people that I know work in mental health, because I know that my opinions are probably going to have some personal bias because of my own experiences. That doesn't mean I'm going to leave out my personal experiences when discussing the topic. It just means that I need to go in knowing that. Now, there isn't like a lot of research on this topic. I tried to find some. A lot of it says that trigger warnings are not helpful, but I also have some criticisms of those studies that were done. Those studies were primarily done on a general population, not on specifically people who have trauma or people who have serious anxiety triggered by certain things. In addition to that, the trigger warnings given in these studies were blanket trigger warnings, or they were only a specific trigger warning for a specific trigger. And those are a couple of the reasons I feel like these aren't entirely accurate, but a lot of the studies that I found were very vague, and they had blanket statements, they had blanket trigger warnings, and they had general populations. I think with a topic like this, you can't measure it as well doing a general study like that. I feel like research on this topic really needs to be done as a case study, because a general research group might not give us the best results and the most accurate representation because triggers are so individualized. I do want to talk about some of the arguments for and against trigger warnings in the research studies that I saw, as well as in some of the posts that I see online about this topic. So I'm going to be talking about some of the arguments against content or trigger warnings, and then some of the counter arguments to those. Because I would like this to be an open discussion. I want this to be something that people can talk about and discuss in a very civil way. So the first argument that I want to talk about is the idea that trigger warnings cause anticipatory anxiety. And studies have shown that giving a trigger warning to somebody can cause anxiety leading up to whatever the potentially triggering stimulus is. So then you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons. On one hand, you can experience anxiety leading up to whatever it is. On the other hand, if someone has, a specific trigger and they are not warned about it and it comes up, they could have a really extreme, intense emotional reaction to it. I'll give you an example. I'm currently reading the Legends of the First Empire series. I'm really enjoying it. I was listening to the audiobook while I was driving one day, and something came up that is extremely triggering for me personally. And it could have potentially put me in a dangerous situation. I was very distraught for my entire rest of my drive. And it made it hard to see, it made it hard to think straight. I was put in a vulnerable position by this. Now, if I had known about it ahead of time, I could have saved reading it for later. I could have maybe skipped over it. I probably wouldn't have. I could have prepared myself. I could have breathed. I could have put myself in a position where I could receive that in a more, productive way or a safer way. The second argument is that people with PTSD and anxiety disorders typically avoid whatever their triggers are. They avoid the things that are going to put them into that state of mind. And exposure to those things is a typical part of treatment for anxiety and PTSD and things like that. And the counter argument to that is that authors and other people that create this media, they are not our therapists. We're not entering into a therapeutic alliance or a therapeutic relationship with this creator. So receiving whatever that triggering content might be, we're not going to be doing that in a therapeutic environment, most likely. So, a vaccine might give you a little bit of something in order to build up an immunity to something, but you're not going to just let some random person give you a vaccine. You're going to receive that from someone who is professional and who has experience and who has education backing that. So if I'm going to be doing exposure therapy, I'm going to be doing it with my therapist, most likely. And I saw something that actually said, if you need trigger warnings, then you need therapy. And I'm of the mind that everyone needs therapy. Mental health system is a little bit broken, so not everyone can have access to therapy. Everyone needs therapy. But just because I'm in therapy doesn't mean that I don't read books and absorb content from different places. And then the last argument against trigger and content warnings is that having a trigger or content warning implies that the person consuming that media is fragile. It projects fragility onto whoever is absorbing this information. And to that, I have to say, whoever creates it is not the person who decides whether I'm fragile or not, and they don't decide whether or not I consume content. One of the arguments in that letter that I read earlier was that they don't want to give explicit details as to what goes on in their book because that would ruin the book. If you've ever seen a movie or a show that has any type of mature content, it'll have a content warning, nudity, sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever. It'll give you that warning, and it's vague. It's not telling you, oh, this character and this character get into a fight and then they do drugs and then they get naked and bump uglies. It doesn't tell you all that information. It just gives you a vague statement, and that just allows you to be prepared for it. Get the kids out of the room, whatever. And the thing is, people have a right to know what they're going to consume, because even if exposure is helpful to me as someone with PTSD, I should have the right to consent to that exposure. And every time I open a book, I'm consenting to reading whatever's in that book. So it would be nice if I could trust authors to, let me know if something like that was going to happen. Now, authors can do whatever they want to their books. It is their book. They can choose to have trigger warnings or not to have trigger warnings, but an author actively speaking against trigger warnings is a little bit more concerning to me, because it's a privilege to not need trigger warnings or to not want trigger warnings. It's a privilege to live without life experiences that make it where you do not feel safe in the world around you. When it comes to consuming media of any sort, it is so nice to know what I'm going into. Just because there's a warning on something doesn't mean I'm going to avoid it. It just means that maybe I can be more prepared when I go into consuming that media. And that kind of goes back to the trigger warning versus content warning. I think content warning is honestly a much more appropriate term because triggers are so specific to different people that potentially triggering content could be honestly anything. But giving a general content warning to these are the things that are often considered triggering to a lot of different people might be more effective than giving just a blanket trigger warning because they're just so specific and they're so individualized. I've seen the comparison several times to allergens. When I look on my granola bar that I eat in the morning, it says may contain nuts. If I had an allergy to nuts, it would be nice to know that there were nuts in something. Does that mean I shouldn't eat anything because I have an allergy? No. It just means that I should probably be careful and maybe not eat things that would kill me. I'm personally allergic to alcohol. I still drink it sometimes because it's not going to kill me. Hopefully. Not the way I'm allergic to it. But it's nice to know ahead of time so I can be careful. And even though I'm really an advocate for content warnings and trigger warnings, I also want this to be an open discussion because I'm not closed off to the idea that they could be harmful in certain situations. I think there's a lot of nuance to this discussion and there's not enough research to really give a good conclusion because even though there is research about it, those studies were very vague and they weren't done on specific populations. And there are a lot of things that could give better answers when it comes to those studies that were done. And I do think case studies could be helpful in trying to learn more about if this is effective or not, having content warnings and trigger warnings. And then there's the idea of maybe it could just be somewhere on the bottom of a book. You know, if I'm trying to grab a book, where's a book? I have 50 million of them. I'll use this beautiful notebook. Personally, I feel like you could easily put it right here, you know, just like they do on movies, rated R for and a couple of words. It doesn't give away anything really, it just says that it might contain these things. Or you could even, you know, turn to the table of contents, appendix, trigger warnings. Go to the very back of the book, see what the trigger warnings are. There's so many ways to do this and to have trigger warnings and content warnings where it wouldn't impact anybody that doesn't need them, but it's there for people who do. And again, authors can do whatever they want, but if they want to make the work more accessible, then this is a really great way of doing it. So please let me know what you think. Are you for or against content warnings, or do you have thoughts that are kind of in between? Do you have any nuance to share when it comes to any of the points brought up in this video? Have you ever been helped or harmed by trigger or content warnings? Let me know. But that is all for this video. Like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and don't forget to let all that breath you didn't know you were holding. Bye! Tripping over shadows and I'm drowning in the night. I feel the soldiers coming and I'm putting up a fight.